I guess we can get started then. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our third presentation in our 5-part series. My name is Olivia Cedarberg. I am the Extension Coordinator with Chinook Applied Research Association, and I am your host today. The following webinars are being brought to you by the Alberta Range Stewardship Course and the Southern Alberta Grazing School for Women. The Alberta Range Stewardship Course is a cooperative initiative of several organizations, including beef producers. It has its roots in the Stockman's Range Management courses that were offered across Alberta in the past. The course provides an opportunity for livestock producers and professionals to come together to share information and expertise because both provide valuable knowledge and skills. Our goal as we share experiences and information is to keep ranching operations sustainable in Alberta economically, but also socially and environmentally. This range stewardship course is offered throughout Alberta and is typically a 1 to 2 day course with a combination of indoor and hands-on field learning. This will be the third year the course has been offered, but due to COVID-19 restrictions, it will be online. The Southern Alberta Grazing School for Women is an annual event that is now in its 17th year. It brings together women to network and share experience and to develop and enhance farm and ranch management skills. The school is also partnership-based and hosted each year by various counties, municipalities, government agencies, and nonprofit groups from across Southern Alberta. The two groups decided to team up in the time of COVID and offer these webinars instead of the usual in-person workshops. So we have a quick poll for everyone. If you could fill this out before we go over some housekeeping items. We would just like to understand who is attending today. The poll should be on your screen now. Simply check your response and you may have to scroll down to answer all questions, then click submit at the bottom of the screen and close out the poll. So a few housekeeping items for today. Your mics will be muted. If you have trouble hearing or other technical troubles, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you lose connection or the presentation, don't worry, the presentation is being recorded today and everyone will be sent a link afterwards. Today's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes with a question period to follow. While we will officially end things at the hour mark, our presenters will stay online for a bit afterwards to discuss if anyone would like. You can ask your questions using the Q&A function. The icon is at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end. If you have a question that is urgent, please use the chat box and we can unmute you if necessary. So now to have a quick look at the poll. So we have 38% are primary producers, 18 non-government, 11 consultants, and then how many people are just watching? 100% are just me. That's good. Everyone's still learning. So, before we get started, we want to take a quick minute to say thank you to all of our organizers and people who came together to make these events possible. So let's get started. Our presenters today are Ross Adams and Donna Lawrence. Ross is a range management specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks. He graduated from the University of Alberta with a bachelor's in science in rangeland and wildlife management. And his work is focused on grazing management and rangeland ecology in Alberta's grassland natural region. And Donna is the range management specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks. She attended the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, where she obtained her bachelor's in science in botany and agriculture and her master's in rangeland ecology. Donna has worked as a rangeland management specialist in Northern Alberta for 28 years. Her work is focused on the grazing management of forested rangeland. So over to you, Ross, to start.
Thank you, Olivia, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Today we're just going to run through kind of the basics and an introduction to range health for those who are new to it, then go through the health assessment methods for grasslands and forests in Alberta, then a few slides on interpreting range health results at the end, followed by a question period. So healthy rangelands perform a number of key functions, including producing forage for livestock and wildlife, helping to stabilize and protect soils and maintain long-term soil stability and fertility. They're important in watershed function as they capture and beneficially release water. They're involved in nutrient cycling and carbon storage, and they provide habitat and support plant and animal biodiversity across the landscape. So what range health assessment does is it provides a measure of how well rangelands are performing those key functions. And it would be difficult and expensive to go out and measure those functions directly. So the assessments are based on more easily observed indicators that can be rapidly evaluated, but which are proxies for those functions. So it provides a quicker and easier method than going out and trying to measure functions directly. And so the Range Health Assessment Guide, the red book pictured to the right, details 3 range health assessments used for different settings. So there's one for native grasslands, one for forested rangelands, and one for tame pastures that have been cultivated or otherwise ceded to tame forage species. And so it is important to use the right assessment for the right application. And so those applications here, probably the most important for the purposes of this course is eye tuning and just helping people on the land to start to see the different components of rangelands and see what their potential is, and to identify where livestock are having an impact that may be negatively affecting the health and function of the land. And then it's also very useful in operational grazing management as a monitoring tool to evaluate whether or not management is meeting its objectives, as well as for assisting grazing planning and adaptive management. And so the basic fundamental idea of range health assessment for any of the methods is it evaluates the current state of a site against that site's potential. And the site's potential depends on climate, soil, and landscape characteristics. These are features such as soil texture, soil chemical properties, the position and aspect of the site on the landscape, whether or not the site is moisture shedding or moisture receiving. And these factors all come together to generate unique sites which will have different types and amounts of vegetation and a different potential, and also which may respond differently under management. So the first step in doing a health assessment is to select a site to assess. And so a good assessment site will be representative of vegetation and range health broadly across the pasture, or in large pastures that may contain several different site types. It may be necessary to split the pasture up by site type and then do separate health assessments on each of those site types, just to make sure that the right potential is being measured against for each of the assessments, as some site types may show radically different vegetation or response to disturbance than others. So it is helpful to evaluate them separately. And so this map is just showing an example of a large pasture that has been subdivided into its component site types, and then potentially each of those could be assessed for range health to get a picture of range health within that pasture. So one of the workhorses of range health assessment are AEP's Rangeland Plant Community Guides, which are based on natural subregions. Natural subregions are ecologically distinct areas of the province that have been defined by broad similarities in climate, landforms, and vegetation. And AEP publishes guides that provide detailed information on site types and associated plant communities. as well as management information and recommended grazing carrying capacities for rangelands within each subregion. And so each of these guides contains a great deal of information and background on the characteristics of the natural subregion. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about a few key pieces of the guides. And so the first is on the left, each subregion guide will have a table near the front of the guide, which provides reference communities and successional communities for each distinct site type identified in that natural subregion. And determining site types is fairly involved and could well be the subject of a talk on its own, so I'm not going to go into that in too much more detail, but I will note that for those who are interested, there's great information in the introduction of the subregion guides explaining how different sites can be identified. So that's a resource for people who are interested. So the structure of this table is that each row is showing a different site type, and then within that site type there will be a reference plant community, which is the plant community that is found under light disturbance. Then successional communities in the next column over are communities that result from disturbance and result in shifting that reference plant community towards a community that is more dominated by disturbance tolerant species. And in some cases, under levels of extreme disturbance, a community may even be pushed into the modified category, the final column in that table. And that is sites where communities have become so disturbed that they've become invaded by non-native vegetation, and in many cases, those plant communities may not be able to revert back to reference conditions under realistic management, whereas the successional plant communities, given management changes that address the issues that caused them to shift towards a more disturbed state, can revert back to reference condition. So then to the right is what the bulk of the guides are. Those are the plant community descriptions. And so for every plant community listed in that table, there will be a page in the guide that describes the community, providing information on the vegetative composition, the plant species composition, the soil and physical characteristics of the site to help users identify whether they're looking at the right part of the guide and looking at the relevant site for what they're looking at on the ground. And it also provides management information relevant to that plant community. So now I'm going to get into the range health assessment itself. So the indicators that are used for grassland range health are the plant community composition, the physical structure of the plant community, hydrologic function and nutrient cycling, site stability, and whether or not prohibited noxious and noxious weeds are present on the site. The first question is plant community composition, and that's looking at whether or not the expected species are present on the site. And how we know what to expect is by referring to the relevant plant community guide and finding the correct site that describes the site you're looking at in the field, and then that will tell you what the reference plant community would be for that site. Scoring this question is based on the idea that rangeland plants will respond predictably to disturbance. Rangeland plants are broadly split up into the categories of decreasers, which are typically the taller, more productive species, but they're not very tolerant of disturbance. And so as the site becomes more disturbed by grazing or other causes, they tend to become less dominant on the site, and the plant community composition shifts to be dominated more by increaser and invader species, which are more tolerant of grazing disturbance, but are often less productive, less palatable to livestock, and can often include invasive species and noxious weeds. So This is based on the idea that there is a consistent shift as disturbance increases from an undisturbed to a more disturbed plant community composition, which can be easily described. So this is just looking at that in a grassland setting. Under light and moderate disturbance, those plant communities are still significantly dominated by taller decreaser grass species. And then the shift in composition becomes more evident when you get to heavy disturbance. And that is going to be a community where the decreaser species are now low dominant or maybe absent from the site altogether. And then when we get to very heavy levels of disturbance, we're seeing even less presence of decreasers, and maybe even some of the increasers are now starting to disappear, and the plant community is dominated by invaders, and there are patches of bare soil forming, which creates a great opportunity for invasive plants to move onto the site. So to score this question, simply take a walk around the pasture and make a note of what the most abundant plant species are, and then refer back to the plant community guide and the reference plant community for the site, and just compare the dominant species that are seen when you walked around the pasture to what the plant community description lists as what the dominant species should be. And if the plant community closely resembles the reference plant community, the site will receive a high score. But as that site becomes more disturbed and decreaser species are beginning to be replaced by increasers and invaders, the score will be reduced. So this is just looking at that sequence of disturbance again, but now with scores attached. So under light grazing, the plant community is basically at its reference condition, and then you see the score decreases as you see that shift from decreaser dominated to increaser and invader dominated plant communities, and that is due to the increase in disturbance. The second indicator is the physical structure of the plant community. So now, instead of looking at individual species, we're looking at what layers those plants fit into and whether all of the expected layers are present on the site. Maintaining a diverse plant structure is important because it allows for more efficient capture of energy and nutrients by plants. If they can use different depths of the soil, they're not all competing for the same nutrients. And this helps to improve productivity. And it also provides more options for animal habitat and supports biodiversity. And in the drier parts of the province, having above ground structure is also important to help with snow trapping, which helps to enhance soil moisture during the early spring when snow melts and plants start growing. So this is scored much like the first question. You would just take a walk, and instead of looking at the individual species now, you would look at whether or not different plant layers are present. So this can be things like tall grasses, short grasses, forbs and shrubs, and ground cover, including moss and lichen. And so one thing to note here is that it is important to work with the right subregion guide for your area to calibrate your expectations, because you would expect much more structure in the boreal forest, whereas down in the dry southeast of the province, grasses and forbs may be the only layers that would occur. So this is just looking at how the scoring for structure goes as a site becomes more disturbed, and the changes can be fairly subtle in grasslands if there's not a lot of structural layers, but tall grasses tend to be the first to drop out under disturbance, and a shift towards lower statured plant communities with very little structure, and those would receive a lower score. The third question is hydrologic and nutrient cycling, and what this is asking is whether or not there is enough litter present on the site. And maintaining litter is of critical importance because It helps to shade and cool the soil surface, which helps to retain soil moisture and enhance forage production during dry periods. And it also protects soil from raindrop impacts and enhances infiltration and reduces runoff. So erosion is less likely to happen where there is adequate litter. And it also contributes organic matter directly to the soil. So litter is very important to the function of grasslands. So to score this question, we get down and rake up all of the dead plant material that is lying on the soil surface with our hands in a 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter or quarter meter squared plot. And that's going to be the dead plant material that is no longer rooted, just dead material that's covering the soil surface. And it gets raked all up and gathered into a ball. And then on page 30 of the Range Health Guide, there is a table and some comparison photos which will allow you to compare the litter ball that you have to what different amounts of litter look like in the hand. And so this is used to identify the amount of litter. And if someone's unsure, they could take it home and weigh it, but just comparing to the images is a lot quicker in the field, and we have found it to be very accurate with a little bit of practice. And so then to figure out what the score is for that indicator, you take the amount you got from raking your litter and compare it to the numbers in the table, looking at the correct natural subregion and then the correct site type, and then whichever of the ranges provided will determine what the health score is. So if it's above these thresholds, it would get full marks, and then as it declines, it moves down to a lower score. The fourth indicator is the stability of the site. This is looking at whether or not there is evidence of human-caused soil erosion or bare soil. And there I emphasize human-caused because, especially in grasslands, there can be sites that are naturally unstable or have naturally occurring bare soil simply because they are in a topographic position or composed of a material or have some chemical characteristic that limits plant growth. And so in this case, instability or bare soil are not an indicator of human-caused disturbance, but just a natural characteristic of the site. And so we emphasize human-caused there because to answer this question, you need to differentiate between naturally caused bare soil or erosion and human-caused bare soil or erosion. So this is a two-part question. The first part is looking at whether or not there are features that indicate that the site is undergoing active erosion. And so these are things like loss of finer sediments, which can expose plant roots or lead to erosion between plants. It could be things like soil compaction or areas where cows have punched through the soil surface with their hooves to form pugs and hummocks, or the formation of non-vegetated trails that are losing soil, or in more severe cases, it could be erosion where gullies are forming and large amounts of soil are being moved from the site. And so to score this part of the question, while the site was being examined to determine the plant community composition, you would also make a note of any of these erosional features that you observed. And the more widespread and the more severe the erosional features, the lower the score will be. And when scoring this part of the question, it's important to look at whether an erosional feature is currently eroding or whether it's an old erosional feature which has revegetated and stabilized, because you only want to score it on things that are actively eroding and not things that have resulted from erosion in the past, but are now stable and not contributing to soil loss. The second part of this question is whether or not there is bare soil on the site. And this is scored by estimating what percentage of the pasture or the site is bare soil. And again, we're just looking at human-caused bare soil, so some sites may have very high naturally occurring bare soil, which isn't indicating any issues with management. And so to score this, you would go back to the description of the reference plant community, and down in the bottom left-hand corner of that box at the top of the page, it will provide a natural soil, bare soil amount for the given site type. And so to score this, you wouldn't start deducting points until soil exposure was exceeding the naturally occurring amount, because if bare soil is under that natural amount, then it's not indicating that it's human caused, it's just a feature of the site. So again, just for this part, very important to differentiate between human caused erosion and natural erosion. And the final indicator is the presence of noxious weeds. So these are noted because weeds are an indicator that the plant community on the site has become stressed and is less able to compete with incoming invasive plants, and indicating that the site is more at risk of weed invasion, which can be time consuming and costly to manage, and also may reduce the forage value within the pasture or on the site. So when we say weeds, we're just talking about prohibited noxious and noxious weeds that are listed in Alberta's weed control regulation, and not just any species that may be referred to as a weed, such as dandelions. It would just be those listed species. However, municipalities may also designate species as noxious at a local level, and so it's worth checking the MD or county website to see if they have elevated any species that may be considered noxious at a lower than provincial level, as they would also be included in scoring this question. So to score the question, you would walk around the pasture and get an estimate of what the percent cover and distribution of weeds within the pasture or the site are. And so as weeds become higher in cover or more widespread throughout the pasture, that will lead to a reduced score. And we consider density distribution as well as cover, because it also provides an indicator of whether or not the invasion is widespread across the pasture or just limited to a couple of locations. Because if the invasion is more widespread, even if it's at a relatively low cover, this is indicating that the entire pasture or the site is stressed and having trouble competing with weeds. And also, it's much easier to manage weeds if they're in a couple of localized patches rather than spread out throughout the pasture. So that is the grassland range health assessment in a nutshell, and I'll hand it over to Donna for forest health.
Great, thank you, Ross. So Ross has given us a lot of detail about the grassland health assessment. So the great thing is that the forest health assessment is based on the same 5 factors. Here's my video. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm going to move my mouse away from that button. Okay, so we have the same 5 ecological factors that we are going to assess the forest range health assessment. So I'm not going to go over these factors in the same detail that Ross did, because he's already provided all that good information. But I do want to highlight some of the differences between how those factors or indicators are assessed or applied in the forest health assessment. And the biggest difference is how those scores or how those indicators are weighted within the scoring system. So when we determined how much of the score to attribute to each indicator, it was based on how much of the ecological function could be attributed to that indicator, that surrogate that we're using as an indicator for that ecological function. So one of the biggest differences you'll see there is on community structure, where in native grasslands, it's a little bit more difficult to speak about structure because all of that is happening within, just a couple of 1 to 2 feet from the soil surface. But in the forest, structure is a really important indicator because livestock grazing impact to the structure does tell us a lot about the ecological function and our management of livestock there. So we'll spend a little bit more time talking about community structure in the forest health assessment. So the weighting is just a little bit different, but the ecological functions that we're assessing are all essentially the same. So let's start with the first indicator, which is the plant composition, or more officially called the integrity and ecological status indicator. And like Ross mentioned, what we're basically doing is looking to see if the plants that we see on the site are similar to what we would expect to see on that site, or the site potential. So it's what we call the reference plant community. So it's very important to take the time in this step to make sure that you know what the reference is. And Ross gave you lots of good information about how to use the plant community guides, which describe reference plant communities for different sites. And we have those guides across the province. And I really encourage you to figure out which guide applies to your area and get one of those. They're on our website, and you'll get the link at the end of the webinar for those guides. But when we talk about a reference site, and you want to compare what you're seeing to a reference site, you want to make sure that you're looking at something that's similar. So you're comparing apples to apples. And one way you can do that is to use the guides. Another way is to find a similar area in the pasture. And we have the luxury of that in the boreal forest, where livestock don't necessarily get to all corners of the pasture. There might be some limitations to their movement or where they travel. So quite often we can find some ungrazed or lightly grazed patches. There might even be a fence line contrast that you can use as a reference plant community, but it's really important to understand what the potential of the site is. We're so used to looking at the graze situation that we sometimes forget what it would look like under light to moderate grazing or ungrazing, what would occur there naturally. So taking the time to determine what reference plant community looks like and reminding yourself of that is really important to being able to assess this question. So next slide, please, Ross. So like Ross mentioned, we have just the same as in forested rangelands, we have decreasers, increasers, and invaders. And what we'd like to do with livestock grazing is to graze at a level light to moderate grazing where we can maintain the decreasers in the plant community, and the increasers, there'll be a proportion of decreases and increases that naturally occur in a reference plant community, and the goal is to maintain those within the stand and not shift to the decline in decreasers, the increase in increasers, and invaders, right? We want to graze to maintain that proportion of decreasers and increasers in the plant community. So in order to assess this question, it's really important to understand what should be growing on the site, and then how those plants respond to grazing, whether they're increasers, decreasers, or invaders. So here's a past year view, and the scoring underneath that shows that if what you're looking at resembles the reference plant community, the decreases are still there as expected, there's very little invaders, and decreaser, increaser proportions are what we expect, then you would score full points for this question. But as you shift to grazing resistant species because of disturbance or timing of grazing, then the score is reduced. And you can tell by the right-hand side that we've really shifted to those grazing resistant species and lost the decreasers and even the increasers by the time we get to the far right photo there. So that's a pasture view for you on that question. So the second indicator is plant community structure. And this is the one that I said was attributed the most in the health score. So I think it's scored from 35 points. So a third of the health points are attributed to structure in the forest health assessment. So I'm going to spend some time talking about structure here. So what we would like to do in any kind of rangeland, grassland, or forest is graze at a level that maintains the diversity and structure for all the reasons that Ross talked about. When we have diverse structure. We have all kinds of layers of leaves, green leaf material capturing the sunlight and photosynthesizing. And what's going on above ground is also going on below ground. So we have all those roots at different layers to capture soil moisture and soil nutrients and really fill all those ecological niches. And when those ecological niches are full, we've got maximum productivity. We have maximized all the other ecological functions. And we can provide all kinds of structure for habitat and thermal cover for wildlife and forage for wildlife as well as livestock. And really we can integrate all other land uses into rangelands when we're maintaining the composition of structure. So really important to be able to graze and maintain all those structural layers. So in the deciduous forest, this is the example we have on the screen here. We typically expect 5 structural layers. Not all deciduous plant communities have 5 layers, but the majority of them do. So again, as Ross mentioned, it's really important to make sure you're working with the right guide and reading those plant community descriptions to understand what to expect for that kind of site and how many structural layers there should be. But in the forest, we will always have ground cover and we will always have overstory trees. And it's the stuff in the middle that's important for livestock grazing because that's really what we affect or impact by grazing livestock. So it's important to maintain the tall shrubs and understory trees. There's some really palatable shrubs in that layer that livestock love to graze. And the medium shrubs and tall forbs are the next layers that have important shrubs for livestock grazing that we want to graze at a level, certainly graze them, but we want to graze them at a level that maintains that structure. So that's a big part of the first question, or sorry, this question is looking at the structural layers to make sure that we're maintaining those. But within a layer, we also want to look at the impact of livestock grazing on particular shrubs. So not all shrubs are palatable to livestock. Some are really delicious to them, like this photo of red osier dogwood. You can see some of the thicker wood and clubbiness to the shrub in the center there where they've been grazing into the 2nd and 3rd-year-old wood. Proper utilization on a shrub is, the livestock will wrap their tongue around and rip leaves away, leaves in current annual growth. That's how they will graze a shrub, which is fine. But when they, when the current annual growth is missing or already removed, then they'll start to browse into the older wood, and that really impacts the vigor and growth form of the shrub and is not grazing at a level that's very sustainable for that shrub. So, and because there's such differences in palatability, some that they really prefer to graze and some that they really don't prefer to graze, if we can look at the grazing impact on those preferred and non-preferred shrubs, we can get an estimate of whether that structural layer is grazed at a level that's sustainable, or if we see a lot of impact on preferred shrub and they're showing some reduced vigor and some funky growth forms, then that might be a very good indicator that that structural layer is on its way out or declining. And we have the opportunity to change our management a bit to relieve the pressure on those preferred shrubs and maintain that layer. But if we've lost preferred shrubs and we're actually seeing grazing on non-preferred shrubs, that's a very strong indicator that we've lost some structural layer, we've lost some preferred species, and the grazing is impacting those shrub layers quite a bit. So here's a pasture view of that, and you can see the 35 on the left, the 35 score is all the layers are present. Those shrubs, preferred and non-preferred shrubs, have normal growth form, they look vigorous, and the utilization is at light or moderate, so at the appropriate level. But as grazing increases, or as grazing continues at an improper season, too early, or there's winter or late season grazing that really impacts the shrubs, then the structural layers start to become reduced, and of course the score declines accordingly. So structure is a very important question that actually has a lot of ways to evaluate the impact of livestock grazing on forested rangelands. So Ross mentioned litter on grasslands, and we have the same indicator in forests, but we measure LFH. So LFH is the dead and decaying plant material on the surface of the soil. It stands for litter, fermenting, and humified vegetation. So as leaves drop and plants decompose and turn over annually, then we get this buildup of dead plant material that decomposes and slowly builds the soil and provides all those same benefits that Ross talked about for grasslands. So in this assessment, we're measuring the thickness and compressibility of the LFH. So we don't have the luxury of litter thresholds like they do in the grasslands. So we had to develop some sort of tool or test way to evaluate the livestock impact on LFH. So we worked with soil scientists to come up with this pencil test. And it's a very simple way of using a pencil poked into the ground through the LFH to the surface of the mineral soil in open areas where livestock have the potential to step. And then we also poke the pencil in protected areas where, like under deadfall or between trees where the livestock are less likely to travel. And we poke the pencil there, and then we're comparing the difference in thickness and compressibility of the LFH between open and protected areas. So it's kind of like evaluating the effectiveness of a sponge. So to get full marks, you want a nice thick LFH. You want that LFH to have lots of porosity, that you be able to compress it so it holds lots of moisture in that LFH. And as the LFH thickness gets reduced and the sponge gets compressed, it's less able to hold water and nutrients, so its function is reduced, so its score is reduced. We're also looking for the distribution of LFH across the site. We want it to be uniform and not patchy. So the score of 20 on the left, again, looks like our reference plant community. It has the plant species composition and the structural layers that all contribute to that LFH. So everything is, we've got thick LFH, we've got a nice sponge that holds lots of soil and moisture and nutrients, and it's not patchy in the landscape, so score of 20. But as the leaf drop declines and as we shift the plant community, the potential for LFH is reduced. Cattle trampling also compresses LFH, so the score is reduced as the LFH layer is impacted by livestock, which makes sense because the ecological function of that LFH is much different when you go across those photos. Okay. So, LFH, between the first three indicators, we've accounted for 80% of the health score and the forested health assessment. So those three factors are very important in describing what the livestock impact on forested rangelands. So we also have a site stability question that speaks about human caused bare soil, which Ross described really well, and then the noxious weed question as well. So they're scored in exactly the same way. They're worth 10 points each, so they make up the other 20% of the forested health assessment, but they're still very important, and quite often they're the hot button issues that get us out there to evaluate management because they're so obvious to be seen. But they're also really great things to evaluate and monitor because when you do range health assessments through time, you want it to monitor change, and if the management changes you've made are having an improvement on any of the ecological functions. So it's really important. These are great photo spots too, to measure and record over time and use that information to help you guide your management. So that's a really quick overview of the forest range health assessment, and I'll send it back to Ross to wrap up with the overall health scores.
Thank you, Donna. So yeah, I'm just gonna do a few slides here at the end on how to sum up and interpret the results once you've finished a health assessment. And so first, just a word on record keeping. There's little forms in the back of the health assessment guide, or these forms can also be downloaded and printed from the AEP website. And to tell the truth, in most management settings, it's not necessary to go to the lengths of doing a formal health assessment and filling out a form every time you do one of these. But especially to start out, it may be helpful to work through a couple of these forms in a formal way, just to get familiar with tuning your eye to the indicators and working through it step by step and kind of understanding the health assessment process. And as time goes on and you have more experience, you can kind of start doing these in your head. You'll just know where to look and what you're keeping track of. And in an operational setting, you wouldn't need to fill one of these out, but can just use them as a tool to help train your eye when you're out in the pasture or driving past and see where there may be issues showing up. But they are very useful as a record keeping tool too, if you want to keep track of long-term trends on certain sites or certain pastures. And so once you've got your health score, you sum up the results of those 5 indicators, and that'll give you a total health score out of 100. And this is true of any of the 3 health assessments. And so a score in the range of 75 to 100 will indicate that the site is healthy, all of those key ecological functions are being performed as they're intended to, and really no management changes would be necessary. A score in the 50 to 74% range is rated as healthy with problems, and that's kind of a warning sign that some of those functions are starting to be impaired by human activities, and so a management change may be necessary to prevent the site from degrading further or to allow it to recover back to a healthier condition. And then a score under 50% would indicate unhealthy, which is telling you that most or all of those ecological functions are now impaired, and the site is at high risk of being possibly degraded for the long term, maybe by issues with erosion or invasion by introduced species or noxious weeds. And so when it's in an unhealthy state, that's an indicator that immediate changes are needed to change the trend of that site. And in addition to looking at the total health scores, it's also worth looking at where in the 5 indicators the health scores are coming down. Is it an issue where the plant community is looking good, but there are noxious weeds, or is there too little litter, or are there broader scale issues that are causing the plant community to shift? So looking at those individual indicators can help to diagnose what the specific management issue that's causing the decline in health is, and will suggest how to address it. And so it's exactly the same idea and interpretation of the health scores and the health categories in a forested setting. And so I'll just conclude with range health assessment is a good, repeatable, and rapid monitoring tool that informs livestock managers and land managers of the current health and function of the range resource, and identifies whether or not range management strategies and grazing systems are meeting their objectives on the landscape, or where objectives are not met. It helps to identify management changes that'll promote recovery of function on those sites. So thanks for your time, and I will pass it back to Olivia for some questions.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So I know there was a few questions that people were wondering where the community guides are coming from. I will post, there's a link in the chat box with the direct link to the Alberta Environment site to download the PDF. And Julie will also share her email if you're interested in a hard copy. Okay, so thank you, Donna and Ross, for speaking. That was great. Before we go into any other questions, we just have another quick poll for everyone to fill out. Should be on your screen now. Please check your answers, and you may have to scroll down to answer all the questions, and then you just click submit and close out the poll screen.
And I'll just chip in there, Olivia. If anybody is interested in getting their hands on a hard copy of a plant community guide, they can feel free to contact myself or Donna, and we can either ship you one out or refer you to the right part of the right office in the province who would have some of those guides.
The same would be true for the red book, the range health assessment book. We can likely give you a copy of that if you're interested. I
Yeah.
think the link that Olivia shared was to the Range Health Guide, and then the plant community guides would be at a different link, but we will share that with you at the end of the webinar.
Okay. I'm just going to quickly close this poll because so we had 58% said yes. Will today's webinar influence your management practices? So that's really good to see. And did you learn something new today? 88% said yes. So that's really good. So I guess we will just jump into the questions now. Just a quick reminder before we do actually, the links will be sent out to all of the sessions. The fifth and final webinar is taking place next Thursday, and it will be live only. And surveys will also be sent out. These surveys really help us plan for future events. So if you could just take a few minutes to fill those out when you get them, it's greatly appreciated. So into questions. I know there was one in the chat. During a range health assessment, can you confirm what is assessed as the polygon scale and what is assessed at the 50 by 50 centimeter plot scale?
So that really depends on the methods and how intense vegetation sampling you're interested in doing. So for a quick rapid assessment, you would assess basically everything except your litter rate would be done at a polygon scale. You'd just get some idea of what the plant community composition, the plant community structure, the presence of noxious weeds, and presence of erosional features or bare soil. That would all be looked at the polygon scale. And then your litter rake is going to be done in one or a couple 50 by 50 centimeter plots just to rake up litter on a fixed area for comparison with the standards in the guide. However, if you're interested in doing detailed range inventory or capturing a more detailed description of the plant community for other purposes, you could actually sample the plant community using a 50 by 50 centimeter plot frame, or we tend to use 10 by 50, so 10th meter squared plot frames, and we'll do 10 or 15 along a transect, and that'll give us a really detailed and robust description of that plant community compared to doing the assessment at the polygon level. But it really depends on your purposes, and really neither approach would be wrong, but it just kind of depends on your purposes. And so just to circle back, all of the indicators except for litter can be evaluated at the polygon scale, and then it's just litter where that the litter rake where that 50 by 50 centimeter plot is always necessary.
And on forested rangelands, it's difficult to see, hopefully, when it's healthy and there's lots of structure and plant, it's hard to see through the pasture. So we really tend to use a walkabout polygon, we call it, which is 10 meters by 10 meters, and we will walk through that quite thoroughly to make sure we're seeing all the plants, and to be able to estimate how much cover they have within the stand and how, their composition in the stand. We really need to walk around quite a bit. So but we will use smaller plots when we need more detailed information. But for the most part, for a rancher or livestock producer, making sure they walk around and making sure that the health assessment, where they do their health assessment, is in a representative spot within that pasture, like Ross mentioned before. So it really is dependent on what the purpose of your inventory or health assessment is used for, like Ross mentioned. But we tend to do things at a larger scale And of course, the LFH question for forests, you have to poke and look at several sites in the area that you're assessing. So that's not within the polygon, but, or sorry, within a plot, but across the polygon. So.
Okay. Where can people find more information on increasers and decreaser species?
So there's a number of different places you can find that information. The plant community guides, all of them will have a, before they get into detailed plant community descriptions in the introduction to the guides, they'll contain a section on kind of the basic ecology at the natural subregion level, and that will outline the key increaser, decreaser, and invader species for different site types within those subregions. And then also there's some good plant guides available, such as Common Plants of the Western Rangelands is a really great resource for anyone interested in range ecology, and they provide really good descriptions of plant community, or the grazing response and the forage value of different native plant species. And it's one of the most useful books I've ever found. I kind of never leave home without it. So it's a great resource for something like that.
And the plant ID book we use in Northern Alberta is called Northern Range Plants, and it may still be available from Alberta Agriculture. We published it back in the 90s. So I think there are some limited numbers of publications out there, but it goes through the common range plants for the boreal forest and forest grazing situation, and talks about whether they're native, introduced, or invasive, and gives you some idea of whether they're a decreaser, increaser. And then, like Ross mentioned, also the plant community guides will describe the plant community type and tell you about increasers and decreasers.
And I just shared a link in the chat for you to find the growing native plants of Western Canada, common grasses and wildlife, if you are interested in purchasing that from Alberta Agriculture and Environment. Northern Range Plants, we can no longer get that book. Is there any thoughts on a different one?
The Lone Pine publications for the, I can't remember the exact name. I think there's an aspen parkland and there's a boreal forest. We use those quite a bit. They don't necessarily speak about plant or describe plants from the range perspective. So they want to have information on increase or decreaser, but they're good plant identification books for sure.
And then
but I think,
sorry, go ahead.
The one Ross mentioned too would also be applicable.
Yeah, it pretty
setting.
well covers the entire province, at least the key species in my experience. It might be missing some of the more rare species in the boreal, but I've found it works pretty well in the north too.
There's a question on here asking, does grazing noxious weeds pose health threats to all cattle and domestic animals?
I think that really would depend. It would vary from species to species. Some species have noxious chemicals or thorns or spines or other things that may be harder on grazing livestock, but many noxious weeds will have no harmful effect on livestock. And in some cases, we're seeing people deliberately using livestock, be it cattle or sheep or goats, to manage noxious weeds, because if they can be trained to eat these plants, they're actually fairly nutritious, and animals will actually start to seek them out in the pasture once they get a taste for them. And so it can actually be an effective strategy for managing noxious weeds. So it would really be a case-by-case basis on what weed species you're looking at.
Okay. And then this one might be a different department. within the AEP, but if there is a dispute between landowners and other stakeholders as to what extent range is disturbed, example like clear cutting, is there someone in Alberta Environment and Parks or other government departments who becomes involved?
So AEP would have an interest in that, especially if it was occurring on public land. But I think Alberta Agriculture and Forestry would have the most responsibility in dealing with land use issues pertaining to logging.
And if it's on public land, so if it's a grazing disposition on public land and there's going to be logging, there has to be a grazing timber agreement developed between the grazing disposition holder and the logger on public land. So those and the purpose of the grazing timber agreement is to bring those two operators together to develop a plan on how they will operate together and coexist on the landscape. So timber is, especially on public land, timber harvesting is something that's managed and is the livestock producer or the grazing disposition holder has the ability to contribute and actively comment on how that'll happen through that grazing timber agreement. But if it's on if it's on public land and there is an land use that's affecting the range resource, then yes, we have ways, we have range agronomists and staff within AEP that work with the disposition holder to address those issues. So.
Okay. There is a link in the Q&A. This link is for the Alberta government documents that borrow from the books that Ross mentioned. Actually, it's the 10-minute mark, so we will just officially end here, and then we will go back into some questions. So thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. Our next webinar is Tuesday, July 28th with our Ranching Women, and we hope to see you there. For those who want to continue to stay with us online, please remember to use the participant icon if you need to raise your hand, the Q&A box or the chat box. Thank you. And then again, thank you to our committee and members and sponsors for putting this all together. So. Okay, so there was a comment from the one that said, Crown land on undeveloped road allowance, but clear cut for utility company, not done previously on this site. And that's response to the last one.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a devil in the details kind of thing, because undeveloped road allowances are actually managed by the municipality. But I would suggest to this person that they just need to contact the rangeland agrologist that's responsible for grazing disposition and talk to them about that situation. So.
Okay. What is the best organic cultural operation of weed control in pastures and improve fertility of pasture land?
Well, I would, if we can, I think we like to try to use grazing as a weed control tool. Like we can use livestock grazing on those weed species that are palatable enough to use the livestock to graze those. We have also used some biological controls, like the release of beetles, and I'm thinking of leafy spurge. I know of some test cases in northern Alberta, but so there are some other tools that can be used, and to be quite frank, we do have to get creative and use all kinds of tools like that because they are very challenging, and we can't use chemical necessarily all of the time everywhere. So we really do try a combination of things. It could be grazing and chemical are quite often used together to address weed issues.
Is there any app development in progress to bring a lot of these guides and resources into the 21st century?
Sure, that would be awesome, and we always have a long wish list of what we want to do with our tools and how to keep modernizing them to make sure they're still relevant and usable. But that all takes time and money, and I'm getting kind of long in the tooth for that sort of thing. But we do have lots of folks that are interested in that, so I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those things developed along the way. I know Noreen mentioned the app that Cows and Fish are developing for riparian areas, so I think that will come. But I think our wish list is much longer than our schedule, our workability. We fall into that same trap as lots of other folks. So.
And then there's one for specific, but where would you find your regional rangeland agrologist? Like, how could you contact them?
Well,
So I saw that question. If you just want to shoot me an email, I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head, but if you shoot me an email after the webinar here, I can look that up and get back to you.
mm-hmm. And there is a list on the government website, but to be quite honest, it is rather clunky and hard to use. So if you don't know for sure, you can start at the county office and talk to them. They will have a short list of names, I'm sure. I'm sure you know your county contact if you don't know your public lands contact. But you can also use the right operator, and I think that service is still available. And to say, you know, I'm in this area, where's the AEP office, and start. But you can definitely fire Ross and I an email and we can send you in the right direction.
Can you put up your guys' contact screen just quickly?
Yep.
Just as a reminder. So their emails are on the screen now. And I don't believe we have any more questions at this time. But if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email Ross or Donna, and they will find the answers if they don't know it, but it seems that they know all the answers. So I guess we will close it out for the day. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you on Tuesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great job.